Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Guys and Chai. I'm Ankur Varma, licensed psychotherapist and co-founder of Brown Man Therapy, a nonprofit focused on normalizing mental health conversations among South Asian men, connecting them to culturally grounded care and building strong community networks. We're very excited to talk to today's guest, who I'm going to intro in just a second. But if you're tuning in for the first time, Guys and Chai is a space where we hope to have honest, unscripted conversations about mental health, identity, and the journeys that we take to get here, including the pressure that sometimes unfolds between men trying to make sense of their lives beyond success. And so I'm really, really excited for today's guest, who has actually been a Guys and Chai guest before the live version and almost exactly a year ago. And so happy to bring Rahim back here for a conversation. I think you all will enjoy it as well. I'm going to intro Rahim a little bit. So Rahim Thawer is a social worker, psychotherapist, speaker, writer, supervisor, educator, a million things, I think. His work centers LGBTQ plus experiences and clinical education for therapists and service providers. He teaches full-time at the University of Alabama, where he's also enrolled in a doctoral program, but I think you call Toronto home. He's also written and edited a few books. He's co-edited and contributed to an anthology called Queer and Muslim on Faith, Family, and Healing, which came out just this year. And then in 2025, which is something we talked about last year in our Guys and Chai conversation, he released a self-help book called The Mental Health Guide for Cis and Trans Queer Guys. And so he's also worked as, you might know him on socials and in public as a politicized practitioner. So a lot of different intersections here in your work, and I'm really excited to get into it. Rahim, I just read out your professional bio that you might find on LinkedIn or on your website. We are not here to talk about your professional bio per se. So I'm going to start off with, who is Rahim the human? And welcome.
Thanks for having me. Rahim the human is silly. Very silly. Just burped. Loves club soda, so that's the burping. Is quick-witted, likes to laugh, likes to be serious and get shit done, but also with lots of sarcasm and humor along the way. Rahim the person, I think about myself as a bit of a container. Like, I hold a lot in my body. Sometimes a lot of that has to do with the kind of work I do and we do, which is therapy. I feel like I'm often like a capsule of a lot of people's heavy feelings and stressors. So that's part of what sits in my body all the time. I also love pizza and cannot digest it. I relearn that every week. Well, that's a bit outrageous. Maybe every 2 weeks.
Yeah. I think it's chicken wings for me, where I'm realizing that at this age, I cannot process such spicy food as much as I'd love to. So
You know
it's
what?
a tough predicament, this one.
I used to not eat spicy food, and now I need spice with everything. So here we are.
Wow.
Our bodies and taste buds are changing.
Evolution.
Yes.
I so much agree with that, because, you and I met very briefly, about a year and change ago in Philadelphia at a conference where you were featured on a panel and as an awardee. And my wife said to me, go sit and talk to him and tell him to come to Chicago and be a part of, BMT and our Guys and Chai series. And literally within a minute, because I don't know if you remember, we were flying off to Boston like an hour or two later. And it was so quick. Like I introduced myself and your energy, your personality took over and I just loved it. And it's magnet. I would add magnetic, and and then all of the things that you just said in terms of, I think you bring such joy and fun to sometimes really difficult topics and, difficult work, right? Both of us are clinicians and we know how much we have to hold, for our
Mm,
clients and, for ourselves and also what joy and humor can do in the clinical setting. And so I really
yeah,
love the way that you kind of described yourself and how you bring yourself into these spaces. I would also add prolific because I think that I always hear from you or see a post or something. I'm like, another book, another this, another project. And so you are very motivating as well because you're doing really, really important work. And some of the work I do here in Chicago also intersects with advocacy, activism, social justice, and equity. And so I know that's a lot of the passion that you carry in your work. And so love to
absolutely.
hear about that as we get into this. So where do you want to start? Because I would love to know, I know so much about your professional um, output and how you
Hmm.
show up. And even, you have a podcast about CBT and, I listened to a few episodes and, it's such a joy because the way that you bring yourself to those, I even listened to, and you were talking about holding a lot in your body. And the last one that I listened to was the one that you had on sensory experiencing and working with the sensory therapist. And so I'm like,
Yes.
how apt that that's the one that I listened to. And you're doing the body scan, you're making yourself vulnerable as a clinician and sharing, so much about the change and the transition that you've been through. I know you've moved. I know you're in Alabama now and you've moved around a little bit. And so I'd love to hear, and for everybody listening, we'd love to hear more about kind of where you've come from and then how does that connect to where you are now?
Yeah. Um, thanks for that. I think people often comment. Can you hear me? Okay. People often comment on how much I move and the places I've been. Um, and that is it's been part of my life, you know. I
Mm,
was very excited during my undergraduate degree uh, to do an exchange program. I was motivated by my friend Farah, who had gone to Singapore during her undergrad, and it seemed to be like this formative experience for her. So, you know, I was born and raised in Toronto. I did my first year of undergrad at the University of Windsor. There was a lot of family pressure to transfer, and it ended up working out well for me. So I transferred to the University of Waterloo. In my fourth year at Waterloo, I did the exchange program and went to Singapore as well. And Farah had gone like probably 4 or 5 years before me. Um, and that was like my first time going really far away all by myself. Um, Along the way, actually, to get there, I didn't go all by myself. I stayed all by myself. But while I was there, sorry, I got there because my brother traveled with me. And we stopped in London and Dubai. We spent a whole month in India, and then went to Singapore. But that year that I spent there was really formative and got me used to being in another place
mm,
and help me understand and appreciate how I want to travel. You know, I can travel by doing the tourist spots and checking things off a list, but I also really love to stay in a place for a while. You know, I like to have a local coffee shop, get to know some people, go to the local bar, go to the drag shows, etc. Um, And so, you know, beyond that, I moved back to Waterloo. I also had, during my master's, I had another opportunity to travel. I went to Melbourne for 3 months to do an internship. Um, I came back and stayed in Toronto for a while. But during the pandemic, I kind of got the itch again, and I moved to Winnipeg for a year, then South Africa for a year. And then I came back to Toronto and things were good, but I decided to do a doctoral program and my application was stuck. They said, actually, you need to be living in the US to do this program. And I was like,
Mm,
why? It's a distance ed program. And they said, sorry, those are the rules. Like, okay. So I applied so my clinical license doesn't translate from Canada to the US. So I was like, if I'm going to find work in the US, it would have to be an academic job. And UA also had an instructor position posted. So I applied for that job. And at that time, I was living in Mexico for like a 3 month stretch because I needed to get out of the Toronto winter. And the job. And
mm,
then I alerted the search commit the director of the doctoral program, and I was like, guess what? I live in America now. Can you process my application? And so it took several weeks, and then they were like, congratulations, you got in. So I got quite lucky because I could have gotten the job and not gotten into the doctoral
mm-hmm,
program. Um, but that's me. Like often I'm moving mountains to get things done, things that I want. And as lovely as that is, it's also lonely.
mm,
Each big choice I've made has come with a lot of reward, a lot of sacrifice, money, isolation, rebuilding community, mistakes. People love to talk about,
yeah,
you can travel here on a shoestring budget. Okay, well, developmentally, if you have everything together, sure. But I mean, not to complain. I've had really great experiences, but also costs along the way. Um, and so here I am, in Alabama, loving teaching, but also isolated in many ways,
sure.
and thinking about the next thing, which
Hmm.
I don't know exactly what that'll be, but I'm always thinking about the next thing.
Yeah, and a few different directions to go with that, and that I know about some of your kind of travel history,
Yeah,
but I'm really like first curious about. Do you think that you? I'm going to ask you a question, but I want to give you a little bit of context too. Do you
hmm
think that you would have had the itch even if you didn't have those earlier experiences of moving around a little bit? Because, for me, I moved to Chicago when I'm going on 14 years or so being here. And, when I left Ohio where I grew up, I had an itch to go somewhere else. And I
Oh,
didn't exactly know what that itch was. I think I knew that I wanted, a bigger city. I wanted different opportunities. And, and I had traveled, I had left for a little while, before that, but I had ended up back in Ohio and I just knew that I wanted to go somewhere else. And I think I could probably trace that back to sometime in childhood, even recognizing like I would want to see what else the world has to offer. But I didn't, we grew up in one house for like 12 years or something. And then I moved to another house. That's where I graduated. So I had some stability in that sense, in terms of geographic location. And so I'm curious if you've kind of traced that back, where does it start? Do you think that is
yeah.
inherent to Rahim or learned or somewhere in between?
Mm. Similar to you, I think it's a response to family of origin. Like my family is like my parents are born in East Africa. They migrated to Canada, um, and me and my older brother were both born in Toronto, and so we moved a couple times, but for the most part, I just recall us having two addresses. Um, so not we didn't move a lot. Just there was one move and two addresses. So, um, I think growing up in a suburb where we had our Jamaat Khana, like where Ismaili Muslims go to pray, was nearby. I had a strong community there, But as I was getting older and also coming out and figuring out my sexuality, it felt like incredibly important
Mm,
to to get the F out. you know, and it's interesting at 21, I was in, 20, yeah, I turned 21 in Singapore. Um, and it's not a particularly liberal place. But, I would say I did a lot of my coming out there because it didn't matter what the laws of the land were. I think what mattered was that I was on my own and with lots of distance
mm,
from family of origin and community of origin.
mhm,
I think my religious community I grew up in was really great in providing community support, opportunity, but it was also really insular.
mm,
It's like they've got you doing something or attending something every Friday, Saturday, Sunday, maybe Wednesday. It's hard to build a life outside that community. Um, and if I was going to explore my sexuality, if I was going to figure out who I am, I was going to need to get out of there.
mm,
And it's not just, I call it an itch, but the way I've come to frame it is like the structure of extended family and family, the religious obligations I grew up with, it actually feels like a vortex. Like you can get really sucked in and you can't find your way out. Everyone's problems become your problems.
mm,
You take on people's anxiety. The idea of like even psychic boundaries is very difficult. Um, so I've chosen to keep a distance. Um, and there's still lots of love. I visit family all the time. Um, there's no shortage of love, but I needed distance to really make myself um, and find myself outside of the template that was given to me.
mm, mm. Can you talk more about the psychic boundaries piece?
Yeah. Um, you know, when people talk about like they use the word boundary, they're often talking about like emotional resources, like say yes to something or say no to something. Um, or they're saying, maybe material, like how much are you spending on this? How much are you spending on somebody else? How much, or boundaries could be about like how much do you consume? How much do you spend? Uh, in this instance, I'm thinking about how I realized that it was impossible to not feel responsible for other people's stress, worry, impossible to not feel like a father or someone else's life plan becomes your life plan or at least something to contend with. So I'm not putting the blame on other people, but I would say I could not create a psychic like boundary, like a division in
Mm,
my mind where I'm thinking about my own life and we live in close proximity and you're doing your life. It just was
mm,
not possible. Um, so the way, and I feel it when I go home and visit family, versus when I'm on my own. There's a lot of loneliness on my own. Like I spend a lot of time alone and that's not ideal. But that psychic boundary is also helpful because then I get to
mm,
decide where my energy goes. Um, and I think this is the one of the challenges of a lot of South Asian families, but they could be other cultures as well, where you follow like an extended family model. So everyone is immediate or everyone's first cousin.
yeah,
um, every aunt is like a secondary parent. And there's something really, truly beautiful about it. And also it weighs, it's heavy,
yeah.
can weigh heavily.
And so in order to create and or maintain those boundaries, you needed physical space from that.
Yeah.
And then because the
Yeah.
pull is great, right? The gravitational pull
Hmm.
there is hard to um, sometimes escape. And I guess that's what I was wondering about too. Is did it feel more like, especially when you're exploring your sexuality and coming out, was it more of a you pulling away from that community for your own identity journey, or did it feel put like a push or a little bit of both as you were going through that?
I'm glad you asked. So right now, I'm 40. I'm almost 41. So that what I just described is very present day about
Mm,
psychic boundaries, the vortex.
mm,
21, 22. When I came out to my family was August of 2020. Sorry, 2007. I just turned 22 then. Um, Prior to that, I was actually in my mind thinking, what if they reject me? What if they kick me out?
mm,
I was planning my life in that way. Like, what if I have to rely on myself forever? And so the coming out experience wasn't great. It was really challenging, but it didn't have that kind of outcome. In
mm,
fact, it was never uh, disowning me or um, kicking me out. Like none of that was on the table.
mhm,
So I could breathe a little bit, and so there's some positives there, right? But at that time, I had been anticipating for a while, like I'm gonna have to be on my own. I wasn't sure what the future would hold, and so here, at that time, um, distance was anticipating rejection. Distance was also finding myself. Some of my closest friends were straight girls I had grown up with, in particularly at school or in my Jamaat Khana, and I'm like, I want to go to gay bars. I want to go
mhm,
dancing. I want to do this. I want to do that. And I remember close friends of mine, a girlfriend of mine that's still, we're still friends. But at the time, she said, "Oh, well, I don't think I'd want to come with you because somebody saw me at that club. Then I don't want them to
mm.
think I'm gay." And I was like,
Wow.
nobody thinks you're gay. uh, like literally no one's going to be thinking about you. I promise. But it's not the nicest response, but it's also we were young, and
Yeah.
we were like I was figuring out my identity, so was this other 22-year-old girl, brown Muslim girl that also grew up in the same suburb. Um, so there's no hard feelings there, but there was a pull to be like, okay, Rahim, you got to do things on your own, you know. Um, I remember, like anytime I've gone traveling, I often travel alone. I go to bars alone. I go to musicals alone. I go to the concerts alone. When I'm in a big city, when I was in Toronto, there were so many Sunday nights where I'm like, oh, I've got the Sunday blues or the Sunday scaries. I'll take myself to a movie. And a lot of people I've encountered can't imagine doing stuff alone.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I do enjoy being with people. Like I'm an extrovert. I'm energized by being around people, but I've come to rely on myself for a lot of things. And it's a nice relationship to have, I think, with yourself.
Yeah, and you both had to and wanted to, and I think that's something too that I would have gleaned, about you is that given your experiences, you have had to be self-reliant, and to go and figure things out for yourself and on your own, and which can be, maybe I imagine liberating in some ways and
Mm.
also scary as hell in others. And so I'm curious, if you could share more about that in terms of balance, because, I, as you know, I work a lot with men, and I work also, being in Chicago, there are a lot of people who are not from Chicago, who are transplants
Mhm.
and who are
Yeah.
trying to build community. And I think naturally what comes up is this part of the journey that they have not had to face before. And I think this is especially true, not only true, but especially true for heterosexual guys, cis guys
Mm.
who have never really had to face that, who
Right.
have had to just mold themselves into what that heteronormative expectation might
Yes.
be. And
Yeah.
now all of a sudden they're coming to therapy and being like, I don't actually know who I just turned 30, or I just turned 25, or I'm 40 with 2 kids. And so I'm curious
Mm,
what you can share about your own who am I journey here, especially paired with, the moving and building your own community piece. How has that gone for you? What have been the wins and the road bumps, speed bumps?
yeah. Well, look, I think the first thing is, and I'm just building on something you said that, people are asking, who am I? I think it's really important that people ask that all the time. And ask yourself, like, when did I meet myself as I am? Am
Mm,
I ready to meet myself? you know? It can sound a bit corny if you're not in our world, but um because for a lot of straight folks that I've witnessed, and it's a generalization, but like particularly in brown communities, the only legitimate way to leave home or have distance from your family of origin is if you could say it's for education or for a job. And so lots of brown people have lots of degrees that they didn't necessarily want.
mm,
But that's the thing that made it okay to live away from your family home. Because otherwise, if you were just like, whatever, I'm going to live in another city because that's what this part of my adulthood is going to look like. There's so much uh, migration stress that gets projected onto you, like all of this narrative of sacrifice and the building
mm,
blocks we had, all of this for you, and you're throwing it away and paying rent somewhere and having fun. So having fun, it like makes you feel guilty, or you're made to feel guilty for
mm,
having fun or for wanting to be adventurous or explore, figure things out. Um, so, we're following expectations. And when we follow expectations and the template that's given to us, you could feel trapped, but remember, you're also getting rewarded,
mm,
right? Society, your family, you're getting rewarded. So when you go against that, it will be tough. And you won't just not get rewarded, you will get punished.
mm,
Like you'll create a life for yourself, and people will be like, well, that's not a real life, or
mm,
you're just not settled down, or you're uh, your priorities aren't in order. There's all kinds of ways people let you
mhm,
know, and that's so I call it punishment, but these are these social ways that people let you know. Um, and so I think being trapped is an important experience, and it's universal. It means we have to pivot and figure out what we want and who we are. I think we also have to recognize that there's going to be decisions we make that get rewarded, and there's some that need to be made. And part of growing up is accepting that I'm not going to be praised for this, you know? Um, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I want to clarify because I think I'm connecting with a lot of this in terms of, are you talking about this as like an assumption that because you left or you went to go kind of do your own thing, that is fun, right? And it minimizes the challenges that come from the
Yes,
doing your own thing and building your own life and, creating something from the ground up that, you really, you don't have that established community. You don't have that established, um, whatever safety or protection that sometimes the collective community, offers. But it also, I think, speaks to some of and maybe this is getting into the systemic pieces of the, oppressive forces of that, right? That, oh, you got away. How did you escape, right? From
yeah,
this. What does that imply about what you're leaving?
exactly. So yeah, I'm glad you brought me back off my soapbox a little bit. Because I think when you're in an insular family or community, the question of who am I is simpler
Mm,
because your environment answers it for you. When I
mm,
am knee deep in an Ismaili Muslim South Asian community, I don't have to answer, what does it mean to be a Smiley? I don't have to answer, what is your relationship to Islam? Are you practicing? Are you not practicing? How does queerness fit into your religion? Um, how are you different from this sect of Islam? How come your mom doesn't wear a headscarf? How come you eat this? Like, you don't have to answer any of these things. One, because you have psychological safety, which is a nice way of saying it, but also you're off the hook because who am I is answered implicitly by your environment. But I'm pointing at the
Mm,
downside of it is that there's hard questions you don't have to ask. You don't have to stand on your own and figure out those answers. And I think when you step out of that insulated environment, not insulated, it's insular environment, and you're in a new place, you're asking who am I and what do I want my life to be, because you're having to ask some hard questions. The environment on its
mm,
own isn't answering it for you. And so there might be things you haven't thought about, like, you know, and you only learn to think about those because of the people you met and you saw how they understood and organized their lives. Um, so for me, yes, moving around has helped me think about, like, answer the question of who am I. It also has made me challenge the idea of authenticity. I think lots of
mm,
people are like, "Ooh, I want to be my authentic self." And I'm like, good luck. Like, that may or may not be a real thing. you know, I think we need to think about it as like, I'm discovering myself at a moment in time and I know myself to be this and it could change.
mm.
And if I'm comfortable and that's my, like, there's comfort in my authenticity, I'll probably need another change. Um, so does that answer your question though about,
Yeah,
yeah?
yeah, and yeah, I mean, and so, I want to, continue that line for you in terms of, when you have found yourself in new geographic places, right?
Mm,
And, I know what the climate here is, in the States, and it has shifted, in lots of ways. And you're also in Alabama, which comes with its own implications. And really what I'm curious about, because when I think back to when I moved to Chicago, I was going through it. I was having a complete, like, who am I crisis. And, I had gone the medicine route and that had not worked out. And that's what I had tied my identity to throughout high school and
mm,
college. And, and so my identity crisis was coming regardless of if it happened at 22 or 25 or 30. But,
well,
and yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, astrology says that one of your identity crises will come between 27 and 31. Like, that's just so, that's when your Saturn
There you
returns.
go.
You just have to have a
There you
little
go.
crisis then, apparently.
Yeah, yeah. And, and I love that you have said here today, like, you have to ask yourself, who am I, multiple times at different points, because that, I think, is part of establishing identity, is coming back to those questions. I can't imagine at 25 or 30, you and I are around the same age. Like, I can't imagine 10 years ago saying, this is who I am, and that not changing. I have changed
Yeah.
significantly in 10 years and 5 years. Right. And so, I think that I love that piece around, coming back to this question. And, and so what I'm wondering is, in the different geographic locations that you've been, because though, and I love what you said about sometimes the environment answers part of that question for you of who am
Right.
I? Um, I'm wondering, how have you had to shift the answers to that question depending
Mm,
on where you are and what you're doing in that place?
right. Look, for the most part, it wasn't a hard question to answer when I lived in Toronto. When I went to school in Windsor and Waterloo, I was younger. And when I was trying to figure out my queer identity and in a new space, those questions sat heavily with me because there was a false dichotomy in my mind that I had to pick who I wanted to be, one thing or another.
Mm,
Um, but, uh, I think why I look back 20 years and say Singapore was so significant was because I didn't have to, I didn't feel like I had to answer those questions in a way that came with any consequence. you could kind of make yourself. Um, and you know, I think the first gay bar or the first gay bars I went to were in Singapore. Um, so the who am I question, I think, gets ignited and supported when there's no punitive repercussion for your response, or to be like, I'm figuring it out, or I kind of don't believe in this, or I've grown up investing a lot of resources in this group of people or this value, and I'm not, it's like kind of garbage now. It's not good for me, right? You can't just say that anytime. You have to be you wouldn't dare say it to yourself at just any time in any place. You have to be in a particular place where you're like, I can think,
Mm,
Um, there is also, like, because you mentioned Alabama, you know, w- when I was in Winnipeg, I was very much a Toronto transplant. People understood me that way. In South Africa, um, there was a lot of nuanced conversations about identity, and it was also beautiful in a way. I met lots of queer Muslims. There's a big Indian, South Asian community. Um, and historically and culturally, it's diverse and rich. The US, I know it's different in different parts of the US, but in Alabama, there isn't a ton of cultural diversity. It's mostly African American and white. And I'm in a bubble of the university, so my colleagues are really great. Um, and my students are great. Uh, they don't have a ton of questions for me. They like
mm,
kind of understand me, but they don't really.
mm,
Um, and so in that regard, like I don't my like when I look back, there's different parts of my travel that feel like they're sewn onto the identity. They're like, oh, they left a mark. And I think Alabama will have left an imprint on me, but I don't know that I will um, carry it with me in the same way. Uh, it's just I've met some queer people. I haven't built a big community.
mm.
Uh, and so my environment's been kind to me, but it hasn't offered me a ton in this particular location at this particular time.
It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it hasn't. It reminds me a little bit of my upbringing where it's like I sense that people had questions but just kind of stayed quiet, and so
Yeah.
it didn't offer a lot of friction, but it didn't also create maybe as much space as maybe you've experienced in other places for you to fully be.
Yeah. And to be fair, Ankur, I will say that I should mention that, we're entering like July 23rd, 2026 will be 3 years of not drinking for me. And that's significant because that was a big part of my social life, my identity. Like I was a cocktail connoisseur, I
Mm,
loved I loved to drink. To this day, people are like, oh, doesn't the craving go away? I'm like, no.
mm,
I was just thinking today, ooh, I would love a vodka martini. Ooh, the sun went down. I would love a little Negroni or an old fashioned.
mm,
No, I think about booze all the time. So I think had I moved here uh, as a person who was still drinking, my social life might be quite different, So that I just
wow.
want to also put that there. I think as somebody who is 40, um, 40 and sober or like California sober, the things that have shifted are like, I can't be bothered to have conversations with new people sometimes. I'm like, oh, this feels like a lot of work.
Mm,
Like another version of me would be like, how fun. Let's have a bunch of conversations and I don't have to talk to these people ever again. It served its
yeah.
purpose. But now it feels a bit different. And yeah, so I think turning 40 and the not drinking and moving, it's like it's there's a confluence of things that are more than just Alabama. When I talk to, I really do like astrology, and I have an astrologer. I talked to her not long after I turned 40, and she said, Raheem, 40 is a good age. It's an interesting age because you're starting to think about what you want your life to be long term, but you're thinking about it in a way that's different from your 30s. It's going to be much more realistic. You're
Mm,
hitting a wall, right? And your crisis is going to be about before you can enjoy the next chapter of your life, you're going to have to mourn the previous chapter. You have to mourn all the things that you're not and that you'll
mm,
never be. By 40, like, you can't suddenly be like, I'm going to be a surgeon. Like,
mhm,
your mind and body can't handle the medical rounds and the
mm,
residency and it's just not happening. So I know we like to think that you're going to you can do anything at any time, but if you can if you can process the narcissistic wound and injury that there's some things I won't accomplish, there's some things I won't be, there's some ways that my body will never look like, you know, you can, I think, recalibrate and be like, here's what I want moving
mm,
forward. But you have to mourn
mhm.
the things that you're not going to be.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up grief, right? Because
Mm.
I think so much we think about the traditional definition or experience of grief as being the loss of a person or a relationship, right? But the pieces of ourselves, the visions or the dreams that we had, and what
Mm.
is possible, right? What is our new potential, as we take into context what our life, where our life has taken us. And so, I think that's such an integral part of the identity and coming back to the who am I, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and understanding who am I not as well, right? Or who have I not had a chance to be? And can I find a way to be okay?
Yeah.
Regardless. And so I really, really like that you frame that. And I wanna bring in, so such a important buzzword, but I think sometimes not always understood is the intersectionality piece. And,
Mm.
you've talked about your religious upbringing, your sexuality, your geographic where you brought. I think that's such an important piece here. Um, I'm curious how and when, the clinician, therapist, and activist piece, how those pieces came in. Was that something that you always, migrated towards in one way or another? Maybe didn't always have the names for it. I know for me, becoming a therapist and telling people in my life, because it was a pivot for me, um, was came with mixed emotion, mixed reactions. And
Mm.
oh, is that a thing? Some people didn't even know it as a career field. And then, does it work? I don't know. Right. And so, oh, like a psychiatrist. And so, there's so many different things that come up when you go into this field, especially from, our cultural upbringings and backgrounds. And so I'm curious, how did therapy and the activist and all of the stuff that has come since, how did that originate?
Yeah. So, okay. I like that question. I will start with a little story.
Sure.
I had a friend visiting me from Australia um, a few months ago, and she stayed with me for a bit. And we went to, I think it was Target or Walmart. I mean, she thought both of those places were outrageous because she was like, it's crazy how much stuff there is. I'm like, listen, this is an American thing. Like, you have to come to these
Yeah.
places to
I was just
see
gonna
how
say, this
wild
is
it is.
America. Welcome. You come straight from the airport to Target.
Yeah, and she spent so long picking things up, being like, "Come on, you don't need a package this big." I'm like, "I'm telling you, you do." People's houses are also storage facilities. You'll learn this. Anyway, so around that time, I had applied for a different job that I didn't get, but I had gotten close to it. Because I'd had a second interview and they're like, we'll let you know. And at the time, so I'm at this Walmart, Target, whatever it is. I get a call from my dad and he's asking about, like, what will you do if you get this job? Like, will you leave your current job? What will they do? How long do you have to give them notice? Where will you live in your next place? Uh, will you rent it? Can you afford to buy it? What kinds of benefits does that job have? I was like answering, and I hung up the phone. And my friend was like, that's a lot of questions to have to answer. Like, you haven't gotten it yet. And half of those questions, like, you would figure out in a time in between, like hearing if you got it and then deciding if you sign a contract. And then if you sign it, then you would maybe decide some of those other things. And she just thought it was so wild. And I was like, oh, I didn't even realize that. But what I can say about it is that I've always felt like I've had to be prepared for questions. I'm going to be asked a lot of questions about the idea, the plan, the viability, um, the financial responsibility, the long-term thinking. Even if I don't know, I need to have an answer prepared. And she said, oh my gosh, I'm just seeing the inner child of you, like, and how it's showing up in the present moment. And over the last few weeks, how I've been seeing you find answers to questions, think about things that I've thought, like, you really, it's stressing you out. You don't need to think about it, but it's all coming together for me. So I'm sharing this story because I think I've that experience that made me have all the answers or think about all the answers in part is due to my family's migration history and fear of losing stability. It comes from a place of possible scarcity or fear of scarcity or fear of loss. I think it also comes from family who feels anxious about making their own decisions, and they do lots of second guessing, and they're sometimes plagued by it, you know? And so if you grow up in a family where even one person is plagued by their uh, second guessing and not trusting themselves, they inevitably transfer it onto you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try not to have that. I will say, you know, that because you asked about like activism, you know, and when the social worker came out, I think a lot of that came through my undergrad, and it did come from a place of exploring my sexuality combined with like I got to have the answers, I got to be prepared for everything. Um and growing up in Islam, I think, and volunteering a lot, being very involved in the community meant community was important to me, but there was a lot of like, I was really interested in like what's right and wrong and helping people. Um, Unfortunately, you know, I don't think religion gives you very many tools, frankly.
Mm.
And so the only way you can understand right and wrong is like through a moralizing framework. And
Mm.
so as I started to explore sexuality and connect with social justice, and think about social work as my career path, I was thinking about all kinds of injustices, right? And I was like, community work through my religious community doesn't serve this larger purpose. It's just not
Mm.
for me. And so for me, that's, I think, I was thinking about human behavior in clinical work, but with social justice in mind, or like
Mm.
systemic oppression. And um this like desire or need to have the answers probably is a thread that can be seen all the way through.
Yeah, and what a thread, because I think, there are so many questions that come with migration, right? And both in a symbolic and literal sense, both of which you have experienced. And,
Mm,
having to be prepared, right, is also, sounds like a piece of survival, a survival technique, right? And, you've had to survive and thrive, right?
hmm
Um, and, I think, I love the story from Target, like the picture that you painted, because, of course, the South Asian dad, that's like, how are you gonna do this? And what's this gonna cost? And, what's the plan for this, right? Just the built-in anxiety of I guess being an immigrant or whatever it is, but being a parent as
Listen,
well. Yeah.
2 days ago, I told my brother and his wife on a WhatsApp chat, I said, look, during the football season, maybe I'll Airbnb my place for a few of the games, and
Mm,
immediately my brother's like, "Where will you stay?" And I was like, "On a park bench. I don't know. Like,
yeah.
I'll figure it out." But
Yeah.
there's a knee-jerk need to know.
Well, yeah, and you have built this muscle that sometimes we don't get to build unless we face necessary adversity. In the sense of
Mm,
resilience and flexibility, right? You will figure like
right.
the and sometimes clients will say, "I want to be more confident in this," and then we kind of pivot the conversation to more self-efficacy in terms of, can you believe that you can figure it out, right? And instead of just
Mm,
that you already know, right? And so that's what I get from you in this, in these two conversations that you're sharing, like that you either already know or that that you will figure it out. And that comes from a lot of the experiences that you've had where you have had to figure it out, because it isn't
yeah.
easy uprooting and then putting the roots in the ground again and watering and getting the sunlight and the nutrients in a completely different environment. And I think that's something that I admire a lot about your journey here, is that you have found ways to do that. And so I'm curious, and I would love for this conversation to continue a lot longer, but I'm curious, if there are, kind of any other messages, lessons, and or takeaways that you've, from your own experiences here, that you want to share that we haven't gotten into.
I think one thing, coming back to the who am I question, um, one way that I know I wouldn't answer that is I wouldn't say, uh, I'm a relationship person. And I've been in a long term relationship. I've been in one long term relationship. It was about 6 years. The best long term relationship. We're still good friends. Um, but I think for a lot of people who are asking, who am I think it's also valuable and important to state, like, part of my identity is being in a relationship and being a contributing partner in the relationship, and
Mm,
seeing how the relationship can uh, blossom, grow, how it can bring out the best in me. I think I think when people are at these periods of existential crisis, or if not crisis, angst, I think it's okay to also say, like, that is a big part of who I am. I just need to figure out what that looks like, or I need to recalibrate who that is. Um, and I think for people who, like, I've moved around so much, dating and cultivating relationships has genuinely felt challenging. Um, and so it's not that that might never happen, but it's important to accept from what the evidence shows you in your own life about w- what's likely to remain in the future, you
mm,
know? So if you've always been a relationship person, you've always been embedded in family, my friend, your future is not going to be you in a desert somewhere. It's just not.
mm-hmm.
Right. So I think mourn that fantasy and think about, this is, for better or worse, become my life and become important to me and integral. If I can accept that, that means there's some things that I won't have, but what will I have? And I think that's important to put out there and ask.
Yeah, and I love this, because I think sometimes people, we naturally have this response when we feel dysregulated or off or unfulfilled, to make a drastic change that is so against our personality and our history. And it's also, that is destabilizing in and of itself, but it's like the instability we feel wants more instability somehow. And I just used this visual with the client where I drew like 4 dots, and then the fifth dot was like the next logical dot. And then I drew a sixth dot, like way over in the corner of the page. And I'm like, what's the next dot that you're connecting this to? Right. And it's obviously it's just that next one, right? Rather than this. And we were talking about it more in the sense of like logical leaps that we sometimes make, right? But
Mm.
also this desire to sometimes make the leap because of the emotion that we're, channeling. And so, something that that brought up for me.
Yeah, I love that a lot because I mean for before I stopped drinking for years, I knew I needed to make a change, but uh to pick number 5 or 6 to do things completely differently, it just didn't match the story. Like, how would my life look? How would my social life look? How would this look? How would that look? And so if you're trying to do something that's really out there, um sometimes you might just make a chaotic decision or a decision that doesn't work for you because it's more cohesive with the story you have so far.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Last question for you, and maybe it's something that you want to build on that you've already shared, but we try to wrap this with providing a tool of sorts for folks to consider for their own kind of life toolkits, and I'm wondering if there's anything, whether it's a breathing exercise or a question that you ask yourself for a thing that you do. What's something that you use for yourself, especially to maintain and boost your own mental health and fortitude?
Big question. I think there's two things. So
Sure.
one is if I can, going swimming is really great. Um, the water gives me a kind of spaciousness to float, to move in a different way. It doesn't have to be aggressive laps. I mean, I can't if I try. Uh, but so being in the water is really nice. Sometimes if I can't be in the water and I've been struggling for a while, I'll think about like how can I get to a body of water? Because
Mm,
that just helps me get grounded. Um, the other thing is like in my mind, it's reminding myself of a lyric from Pocahontas, the song
okay.
"Colors of the Wind." Um, and she talks about, you think you own whatever land you land on. The earth is just a dead thing you can claim. And then blah, 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 blah. Later, it's like, can you ever just walk around and see beautiful things and never wonder what they're worth?
Mm,
And I think about that because capitalism has me on a hamster wheel all the time about the material things people have. Um, I could take a long walk and think about the real estate value of all the houses along the way. And I think it's really important to not do that, to really not think about how much everything is worth. Everything, I get it. Everything has an economic value, but it's nice to intentionally not think in those terms. I find that reminder helpful.
it's a great reminder, and I really love that. And so, okay, so really appreciate you being on. I'm a big admirer of your work. The book that we talked about last year, Guys and Chai, has helped me. I come back to it from time to time in terms of my own clinical practice and how I show up for my clients. And so I'm really grateful to you for the work that you do. Where can people find you and follow you in the work that you do?
Well, my website is pretty easy to find. It's thepoliticizedpractitioner.com. Um, if you want my socials, it's allmylinks.com/ the politicized practitioner. And those words are basically how to find me.
Great. All right, Rahim. Well, thank you, thank you, thank you so much. And I wish you all the best for the rest of your time there in Alabama and whatever comes next. So appreciate you,
Thanks so
and
much.
we'll talk soon.
Take care.
Hey, so I'm back with my reflection, my final thoughts here on my conversation with Rahim. I really enjoyed this one because Rahim has done a lot of work in the clinical field to provide insight and guidance for not just folks who are looking for their own identity and going through that process, but also for me as a clinician. His book last year, the Guide for Queer and Cis and Trans Queer Folks, really opened my eyes into how to be a better practitioner as well as an ally. And so, always love talking to Rahim and following the work that he's doing. A couple things really stick out to me about our conversation, really related to identity. I first, he talked about asking yourself this question of who am I multiple times, right? Not just once in our life or twice, but as a constant piece of our kind of thought dialogue and of our process. And so, I think this is something for myself I've recognized over the years, in my 20s and my 30s, that I have answered that question different ways. And so it's an important question to come back to, not just when life is questioning it for us. And so, and it really does connect with when we talk about mental health and we talk about therapy. A lot of times people come to therapy when something is wrong and when we have something that is quote unquote maybe diagnosable. And so we're experiencing hardship, conflict in our relationships, depression, anxiety, whatever it might be. And innately that questions who we are, right? Because we're noticing, or maybe somebody in our life is noticing, we are not quite ourselves. And so naturally, a big part of this therapeutic process is asking, who am I and who do I want to get back to? Or who am I going to be next after I overcome the challenges that life is throwing my way? And, the other part of this that he talked a lot about was, leaving and moving. He's moved around quite a bit and experienced a lot in different parts of the globe, different cultures, different communities, and has had to build and rebuild his roots. And that's a really resilience building process. It's also a really challenging process, and so I really admire him being so open and vulnerable about that piece. And and I think how that ties it back into the identity side of things is that when we leave, and especially when it looks like to everybody else that we're leaving to do something for ourselves, we are again questioned, who are we, and are we still a part of that community that we're quote unquote leaving? And so I think that's part of the challenge here. And I really am going to reflect more and think more about this process, because I know for myself, when I think about leaving Chicago, a place that now I've made my home, these questions start coming back up and are worthy of facing rather than avoiding. And I think that's something I hope for my clients in therapy, and something I'll work on myself as well. And so really hope you enjoyed this conversation and took something away from that. Hope to see you again soon at our next Guys and Chai.